Alright guys, today we're going to go over how to build this absolute beast of an FPV drone. I've spent so long trying to figure out the best parts to use for the best value for a drone that's going to fly cinematic and freestyle really well, and this is what I've come up with. You'll see how it flies at the end of the video. It just flies like an absolute beast and I'm so stoked with it. If this is your first ever FPV build, then this video is going to work for you. I'm going to go over everything super slowly, step by step, and try and explain everything. There's going to be links to everything I've used to build this, all the parts for the drone, as well as the tools you're going to need. Alright, let's get into it. The frame is an Impulse RC Apex Evo. It's the frame that Mr. Steel uses. It looks to be one of the best quality frames I've ever seen build wise. It comes with so many spare parts and I just love the look of it. Before I put a frame together, I always like to give the edges a little sand down. Best to use wet sandpaper or wet the frame down a little bit before you do this, just so dust doesn't go anywhere from the carbon. It's just going to give the edges a slightly softer feel. Let's get all these other bits out of our box and have a look. Alright, let's mount the press nuts on each arm of the quad. There's only one way that these can go in, so it's hard to get it wrong. And an easy way to do it is to just pop an M3 screw through the other side and tighten it in. Just make sure you don't tighten it up too much, only until the nut is flush with that arm. Now we're going to do the exact same thing on the upper main plate. We're going to mount those nuts on the top side of it. Just use the same technique as before with the M3 screw and wedge it up into the plate, and just don't screw it too hard. Just until it's tight is fine. The press nuts should be sticking out of the top side of the plate. Now let's secure the arms and key to the lower main plate. We're going to use an M3 by 8mm cap head bolt with thread locker and a cone washer. Put the bolt through the washer and into one of the inner arm mounting holes. And then attach the arm to the lower main plate using the embedded press nut, and just don't fully tighten it. Then we're going to repeat the process with the other three arms. Just don't do it too tight yet, because we're going to put that key in there after, and it's going to need to be shimmied in a little bit. I think it's easier to put the key in when you only have three arms on, but you can do it this way as well. Alright, now let's install the mounting bolts for our stack. We are going to use the 30x30 mounting holes, which are the ones on the outside because they're the ones that fit the stack. We're going to use the 20mm mounting bolts because they're the only ones that fit with this stack. You're just going to need to screw the bolts through that hole, and if you just use something to hold the nut, then you can screw it right through that nut, and you can screw this one in nice and tight. Make sure you're not using the bolts that come with the SpeedyB stack because they are too high for this frame. You're going to need to swap those rubber dampeners that the stack comes with. Swap them with the ones I've linked in the description, which are a little bit smaller. That's the only way that this stack is going to fit inside this frame. Another thing you could do is try to just cut each dampener down a little bit, but it's quite hard to get them all the same height. Now let's install the shoulder bolts through the lower main plate and the arms. Let's grab one of our black washers and an M3 cap head shoulder bolt and just screw it through the bottom of the plate up through the arm. The arm should feel pretty tight and locked in now. Now let's mount the standoffs. The standoffs at the back are slightly longer than the front ones, so let's do the 4 back ones first. We're going to use the M3 screws again, and I've used the 12mm ones, but you can use the 9mm ones as well. The smallest ones or the medium sized ones, they're both going to work fine, and there's enough spares to do either. Now let's pop those front ones on too. Don't worry about the spacers at the very front because that's going to be for the camera mount. Let's use those same screws to mount the camera frame. Just pop those little 3D printed TPU mounts in there too. Let's install the motors now and the arm protectors. I love these arm protectors because they're nylon, which means they slide really easily, so you can slide across the road with your drone. You're just going to be using the 10mm M3 button head bolts for these, so you're going to need 16 of those bolts. They should all be in there with your frame kit. I forgot to install this bumper before, so I'm just going to do it now. I like to wrap the motor wires around the inside of the FC. It just keeps the wires out of the way of everything. So let's measure the length of the wires that it's going to take to solder this and make sure you give yourself plenty of room, don't have it tight. Now we're going to route the capacitor underneath the FC here, right underneath everything. Just use some leftover motor wire, but make sure you've got enough length there to sit the capacitor at the front of the drone. Let's flux and tin underneath. I like to keep my soldering iron pretty hot, usually above 400 to 450. It just seems to work the best that way. Let's solder those wires onto the underside of the ESC. Make sure you've tinned it again on the wire as well as on those pads where you've got solder already, just so they're going to stick together again. You should be pretty confident just to hold the ESC by the wires like this. Just pop a tiny bit of tape around the positive wire so you know which one's which for later. Now let's flux and tin those big pads. Just put heaps of solder onto this, don't be shy with it. If you've got blue tack handy, then use that. Otherwise I've just used a piece of double-sided tape. It does not work as well. Now this is the hardest bit of soldering that you'll have to do for this whole build. You're going to want as much heat as possible with your solder on around 450 and just push down on the top bit of that wire on each side until it just heats up and sinks into that tinning. If you've done a great job, it should just look like one big blob, not even like two separate pieces. Now let's tin each of the motor pads. And again, when we tin them, just make sure you flux first, then you tin. You don't need plenty of solder, just a good amount, and you're just looking for those single blobs, single balls of solder. Now I'm just gonna tin and strip the ends of each of these motor wires. Again, I'm just always adding flux before I put solder on anything. And let's just leave those motor wires ready to go for now. And again, you should be super confident that it's strong and you're gonna pick things up with just the wire. Now let's get the capacitor soldered onto these wires. Make sure you have fluxed and tinned both ends. And you're going to use a little bit of heat shrink and just shove it right up the other end of the wires so that it doesn't heat and shrink when you're soldering it. Just make sure the wires you've used are long enough so that the capacitor can sit in front of the stack. Now let's shimmy our heat shrink up so that it covers the joints. Push it right the way down so none of the metal's exposed, and grab a lighter and shrink it. Here I'm just bending it a little bit to make sure it's going to sit the right way in where I picture it sitting. Now let's get these motor wires soldered up. Just make sure, again, you flux both the wire and the pad before you do this. It's also worth covering up the top of the ESC with some tape or something, just so you don't accidentally put the soldering pen on it and melt something. Make sure you've done enough practice on a practice soldering board to do this, and just keep your solder nice and hot and just aim for getting those single blobs. One thing to be mindful of is to not hold heat on the pad for too long, because the pad can actually detach itself, and that's really problematic. I'm definitely not the greatest solderer out there, and if you're not feeling too confident, I'd definitely recommend looking at some other soldering tutorials just to make sure you got it. Alright, so let's give each of these wires a little wiggle, a little pull, just make sure all of them are super strong. Let's cut out a little square of double-sided tape, and we're going to place that capacitor in. Once you've placed it in, grab a little bit of black electrical tape, or just any electrical tape really, and wrap it around the standoff and the capacitor. And after that's all sitting in place, we're going to grab a little zip tie and wrap it around everything just to secure it perfectly. Now you don't have to do this, but it's helpful. If you grab your multimeter, turn it on and put it in continuous mode. Make sure you've plugged in the red and black pens and put it onto the corresponding pads on the XT60. It should do a little beep and then count down to 1. And that means that everything is soldered correctly and the capacitor is working. While we're here, let's whack these little wire protectors on the arms and fasten them down with some electrical tape. And now comes the moment of truth. Please use a smoke stopper for this. You can ruin everything if you don't, and they literally cost a couple of bucks. So plug the smoke stopper into the XT60 cable and then plug your battery in. This is always a really good moment when you're building a quad. It's the first time you get to see everything come alive. Now let's drop in our DJI 03 or 04 if you're going to use that. So let's pull up the stack and let the line from the camera to the VTX run underneath the stack at the very bottom. And we're going to have the 03 module upside down mounted, and we're going to remove the screws and then screw them in from underneath from the bottom of the frame with the small black washers in between. This way just made the most sense to me regarding this build. A lot of people like to just mount the VTXs with some double-sided tape and zip ties. You can totally do that as well, but I really like having it hard mounted underneath the frame like this. the little bit of double-sided tape we've used is also going to act as a dampener. So it should look like this when it's all screwed in from underneath using those smaller sized black washers. Alright, now let's flux, tin and solder our ELRS module. Here is a wiring diagram so you can see more clearly the parts that I'm wiring right now. The one thing to remember is RX is going to go to TX and TX is going to go to RX. Apart from that, it's just ground to ground and 5V to 5V. The ELRS module is going to run out the back of the drone, so just maybe cut the wires down to a point where it's going to sit kind of right in front of that VTX, but again, just give yourself plenty of room. And once it's soldered on, let's just twist those wires around so they're all nice and neat and wrapped around each other. Now let's pop on the actual antenna at the back and use that little bit of heat shrink that the module comes with. And same thing as before, we're just going to grab a lighter and really just soak it in heat so it wraps around nice and tight. So I've just pulled the ELRS module underneath the stack and a little bit of double-sided tape on the back of the module, and we're just going to squash it down into the frame with all the wires going underneath the stack and behind. The module is going to sit just in front of the VTX there, and you can just leave the antenna sort of poking out for the time being. Alright, now you're going to need a USB-C cable, and we're just going to plug this thing into Betaflight and get all those motors going the right way. Let's plug our battery in, go to the motors tab and hit motor direction and choose change individually. And we're just going to hit each one at a time and just make sure that it's spinning in the direction that it's indicating in Betaflight. One way that I find makes it a little bit easier to do this is just spin them as slow as possible and just run your finger around it and make sure it's spinning that correct way. Now let's configure that ELRS module. Let's really quickly plug in and unplug the battery 3 times in a row, and then we'll see the ELRS module blinking green, or is it orange? I'm colorblind, I don't know. It just blinks, and that means that it's searching, it's trying to bind, and at the same time you want to hit that bind button on your radio and they're just going to bind with each other immediately. Now I'm just going to go back into Betaflight and I'm going to assign these buttons on my controller. This is the configuration that I use. You can do it any way you like. So go into that modes tab and find out which buttons on your controller correspond to which AUX input and just hit the ones you like. The only buttons I'm assigning are arm, beeper, angle mode, flight modes, that's optional, and flip after crash. I find that's all I really use when I fly FPV. And now we're just confirming that each of those modes is assigned correctly. Let's test this out with that battery plugged in. Yeah. Now let's get our VTX cable sorted out. If you're running ELRS like I am, you're going to need to remove the S-bus cable. That's going to be most likely the yellow cable here. If you're running a DJI remote, just keep the cable in because you're going to need it. I just connected 2 zip ties together to pull the cables down and neaten it all up. Now we're going to jump into Betaflight again, hit the ports tab and go to UART1 and select VTX MSP plus DisplayPort, then save and reboot. Now let's solder our little beeper on. This is only 3 wires and it's super simple. Again, you might want to trim down the wires for space. I really recommend using one of these beepers because inevitably you're going to eventually crash your drone somewhere and not know where it is, and it's so good just to click a button and hear how loud these things go and you're going to find it immediately. Again, we're just going to use our double-sided tape technique on the bottom of the buzzer and put it up the front, next to the front left standoff. The cap should be on that front right standoff. And we're going to use a small black zip tie and zipper on there. Let's just plug the battery in and check that the beeper is working. Now let's get that ELRS antenna fixed in nicely. What I've done is just popped it right out the back of the drone there. So it's just sitting, and I've shoved a zip tie through the bottom of the drone, over that wire and out the other side. And I'm just going to tighten that zip tie off, and that's pretty good for this antenna. Now let's screw the O3 camera into the front of the frame. The small screws will come with the frame kit. I'm just going to put the rubber grip for the battery on the top plate, and I've just sanded it down a tiny bit just to let the adhesive offer a little bit more grip on there. Let's screw that top plate on and see how everything looks. This drone can easily carry a full-size GoPro, but for freestyle I think the DJI Action 2 is the best around at the moment because it's so light. So I've ordered an Action 2 mount, and I'm just going to screw that in. We're going to need to use the slightly longer screws just to make their way through the mount. I think they might be 12 mils long or something like that. Just going to use a second piece of black electrical tape to fasten down each arm, so each arm has two. That's just what Mr. Steel does, so I'm just copying him. Let's pop the props on. Just make sure they are oriented correctly. Remember the order that Betaflight says your motors are going, and just orient the props the right way. Now let's put that action cam in there, and let's also put those battery straps on. I would always recommend using 2 battery straps, even though there's not much space for it on this drone. Using 2 battery straps is just going to make sure that the battery is not going to be ejected out of the drone when you crash. And there's no if you crash with FPV, it's when, and for me, I'm crashing pretty much every single flight at least once. I'm using 1300 milliamp hour 6S batteries for this. I think you could use anything from 1000 to 1500 and you'll be fine. Another little thing I like to do is put a hair tie on the front strap, and then I wrap the XT60 connector through that hair tie so it all stays very secure. I'll then twist the balance lead and shove it in between the wires just to make sure it's out of the way of the props. We are good to go. This thing is ready to be launched into the air. Everything looks super neat. I hope if you've built it too, that you're happy with how yours looks. And I'm keen to hear how everyone's experiences go who built this drone. Good day for it. Good day to get out there. Oh yeah. Oh, the O3 is so much better than the bloody Vista. Oh man. It feels smooth. It feels very smooth. Oh my god, dude. This thing's on rails, man. Woo! Oh. Yeah, this thing flies good. Zero prop wash there, are you kidding me, bro? What? God, I said I was just gonna chill, didn't I? Yeah guys, this thing flies very well.
Just does everything right. Punch out. Yeah, whether this is your first ever 5-inch build or it's your first 5-inch drone, this is a great drone to have. Even if you've flown other 5 inches and stuff, and you want to just build your own one first, man, just build it. Like, it's literally, if you're just learning to fly a 5-inch in FPV, you can fly this drone. If you've been flying for ages, you can do the same thing. Build the same drone, just tune it to however you want. Tune it up or down. Whoa, the battery is very low. I need to land. I just probably just killed that battery. I was not looking at that. Oh man. This thing is very dope. Very dope. Radiomaster boxer, DJI Integra. All of it is just coupling together really nicely. Just stoked with this build, honestly. Absolutely rips. Yeah. Let's go! Let me know if you built this or if you built a similar version in the comments. Let me know if I missed stuff or if you have ideas on how to make it even better. Hit me up with a sub if the video helped you. 99% of my viewers are not subscribed. Literally 1% are subscribed right now. Yeah, please hit us up with a sub and a comment. I love the dialogue. All right, catch you later.